Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It's time to take some of your questions, and our first one this week comes from David over on Patreon, who asks a couple of questions rolled into one. He's looking for a clarification on the separation of powers between governments and police. A government or minister can't direct police operations, but when Trudeau or premiers talk about barricades needing to come down, does that influence the police or to take some kind of action? Are police not part of the executive branch too? And the second part of that is also, could the RCMP just refuse to enforce the court injunction? Okay, a few things to consider in there. First of all, he's correct in that government can't direct the operations of the police because we are not a police state, and that's kind of a good thing. The signal that Trudeau was trying to send by saying the barricades need to come down, the blockades need to come down, a lot of that was also directed toward First Nations leaders in order to say, talk to your people, tell them that, we've got the message, it's time for those to come down, that kind of thing. And he's hoping for pressure internal of the community to help resolve the situation in that regard. I don't think it was that effective, particularly given that when earlier in the week there was a particular Mohawk chief who was part of the press conference that the national chief of the AFN held, who was talking about how, taking down the blockades isn't surrender, it's moving on to the next stage, so on and so on. And shortly thereafter, he got all kinds of threats in his own community and had to walk back that statement. So yes, Trudeau's attempt to speak to First Nations leadership in that regard didn't really work as well as anticipated. I think there is a certain amount of police kind of taking the hint there. It's not political direction, but it's kind of like the overall mood of the country, which I think they could also kind of read just in terms of public opinion. But that's more or less the dynamic that was at play there. It was kind of trying to give a more of a general sense of what the mood is at. And, in the beginning of the week, Trudeau signaling willingness to have dialogue and so on, trying to build that political capital. And then by the Friday saying, okay, it's time now, guys, let's wrap it up. At that point, starting to expend some of that political capital in terms of trying to move things to the next stage. It somewhat worked. Yes, there were more protests in the days that followed, but those have largely all died down by now. So I think, it essentially did what it was set out to do, even if it wasn't quite as smooth as we had all hoped it kind of would be. As for the RCMP, they do have discretion in terms of not enforcing the court order. I should also clarify, it's not just the RCMP, because in Ontario it was particularly the OPP, and in Quebec it's the SDQ, who is currently not enforcing the injunction against a blockade at Kahnawake. So yes, it's all about their having the discretion to in terms of how they're going to enforce that court order, and they have been trying to use other de-escalation techniques because we've had such a bad history in Canada with these First Nations protests, whether it was Oka or Ipperwash or Caledonia. And, we've had instances where police died in some of those situations because things escalated too quickly and so on. So that's why there's a great deal of hesitancy and reluctance to kind of move against the blockades in that regard. Our next question comes from Mrs. White over on Twitter, who says, a lot of outrage has been directed at the PM for sitting on the tech approval for months as though it was the only thing holding up the project. However, days before tech pulled out, there was another story out there about how some of the local First Nations were having concerns about the response from the provincial government. And she asks, was this known by the PM and was it also causing a delay? I'd say once the story was out there, yes, absolutely PMO would have been aware. They do have media monitoring in there. I don't know that there was any particular lines of communication between that particular First Nation and the federal government, but it's possible that the Minister, Carolyn Bennett's office or someone had been aware of it. So that is always a possibility. That's not something I can verify, but nevertheless, it would also likely be a case where that was a question of provincial jurisdiction. And what had happened in that case was it was the provincial government who had kind of fallen by the wayside. What had largely happened with a lot of these negotiations with the First Nations in Alberta around TAC Frontier was that it was the Notley government who went and made the effort and got all the sign-on, and when Jason Kenney came to power, a lot of that kind of fell to the wayside as they considered it a done deal, and things that were outstanding that were supposed to have been worked on were not picked up on, and that was kind of what that particular First Nation was talking about. As for would that have been one of the reasons why the cabinet sat on that decision, I don't really think that was it. I think part of it was just in terms of priorities. It was low on the list in terms of when it was first brought to cabinet in July. Cabinet has a lot of decisions to make in a single week. A lot of appointments and orders in council and all kinds of things, and Trudeau seems to run a much more I would say cabinet focused. So whereas Harper would rarely have the whole cabinet meet, but just cabinet committees, whereas under Trudeau the whole cabinet does tend to meet on a weekly basis when Parliament is sitting. So I can imagine that to a certain extent it just wasn't high on the list of other things that they needed to accomplish at the time. The other thing we need to remember is the reason why there is a cabinet decision in a project or in an approval for a project like that is because there needs to be a political calculation in terms of yes, the Joint Review Panel said that there will be significant environmental harm from this project. On the other hand, here are the benefits which were calculated at 70 billion in revenue and so on and so on. Does that 70 billion outweigh the environmental damage? It could, but given the price of oil and so on, that 70 billion figure was no longer on the table. It was going to be far, far less. And would that far less revenue be worth that same environmental damage? And that's kind of the balancing act that cabinet was wrestling with on that. And I think that was partially why they were taking as long as they did, because it is a very tough decision. It didn't help that certain people were making a complete symbol out of this project and trying to, treat it as the salvation of the Alberta economy, which it never was going to be, particularly because even if it had gotten approval, it was never going to be built anyway, at least not in the medium term, because the price of oil just would not make the project viable economically. So I think that it was just that balancing act and trying to weigh those various factors that was keeping cabinet. They had a deadline, they were sticking to that deadline, but they weren't going to go out of their way to approve it beforehand. And I don't think it would have mattered if they had approved it when it came to their desk in July. If they had, like we said, the price of oil was not enough to justify the project to being economically viable, so it wouldn't have mattered anyway. Even if Teck had gotten the approval, it wasn't going to get built, and it was never going to save the Alberta economy. And we should kind of stop pretending that it was. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.